In light of Cardinal Viganio's testimony about Pope Francis and the homosexual cover-ups in the Church, the time to discuss the nature of the problem is upon us. Many Catholics refuse to acknowledge that Pope Francis has done anything wrong, and that's fine, I guess. But for the sake of transparency, I'll say this. I can easily see Francis being guilty of the charges laid against him. It is well past time for an investigation into these questions, especially in light of his breathtakingly inept response to the media when asked about the report. If you hadn't heard, when asked by the media, he simply told the journalists to look into it for themselves and to make up their own mind. That's stunningly inept and almost indicts him by itself. But the problem in the Church is heresy. If you only look at the surface issue, the problem is homosexuality and pedophilia. But those aren't the problems at all, at least not by themselves. The problem is heresy. Homosexual pedophilia and heresy are joined at the hip, which I and others have called homo-heresy. I'll explain why this is actually a problem of heresy primarily and not predation. But first we need to define our terms. There are two forms of heresy, material and formal. Material heresy is when beliefs are adhered to and expressed that are clearly contrary to church teaching, but done so out of ignorance. Formal heresy is knowing that the belief is against church teaching and adhering to the error regardless. Let's dive into heresy itself a little bit deeper. The formal definition of the heresy according to the Church is in the Catechism of John Paul II and Canon 751. Heresy is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, or it is likewise an obstinate doubt concerning the same. Apostasy is the total repudiation of the Christian faith. Schism is the refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff, or of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. The definition is rooted in the work of Gratian and Aquinas. Heresy is basically doctrinal error held stubbornly in defiance of the Church. In the 12th century, Gratian argued that heresy was the rejection of orthodox doctrine after correction was offered. Thomas Aquinas defined it as the denial of faith as defined by the Church. Wait a second, though. If it is heresy to defy the pontiff, how is resisting Pope Francis just? Canon 212 gives us the answer to that question. According to Canon 212, conscious of their own responsibility, the Christian faithful are bound to follow with Christian obedience those things which the sacred pastors, inasmuch as they represent Christ, declare as teachers of the faith or establish as rulers of the Church. The Christian faithful are free to make known to the pastors of the Church their needs, especially spiritual ones, and their desires. According to the knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess, they have the right and even at times the duty to manifest to the sacred pastors their opinion on matters which pertain to the good of the Church, and to make their opinion known to the rest of the Christian faithful, without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence towards their pastors, and attentive to common advantage and the dignity of persons. In other words, the faithful are free to question pastors openly and publicly without having our faith called into question. So my claim that this is at least in part about homosexuality and not pedophilia, right? The Church has this to say about same-sex attraction. In paragraphs 2357 to 2359 of the Catechism of John Paul II, under the heading of chastity and homosexuality. Homosexuality refers to relations between men or between women who experience an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction towards persons of the same sex. It has taken a great variety of forms through the centuries and in different cultures. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. Basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine, effective, and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. The number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial. They must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and, if they are Christians, to unite to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. Homosexual persons are called to chastity, by the virtues of self-mastery that teach them inner freedom, at times by the support of disinterested friendship, by prayer and sacramental grace, they can and should gradually and resolutely approach Christian perfection. So, same-sex attracted priests. Let's take a broader look. The main job we typically think of for priests is celebrating the Mass, which involves the consumption of the Eucharist by the priest. According to John Paul II in Ecclesia de Eucharista, in cases of outward conduct which is seriously, clearly, and steadfastly contrary to the moral norm, the Church, in her pastoral concern for the good order of the community and out of respect for the sacrament, cannot fail to feel directly involved. The Code of Canon Law refers to this situation of a manifest lack of proper moral disposition when it states that those who, quote, obstinately persist in manifest grave sin, end quote, are not to be admitted to Eucharistic communion, which is a reiteration of Canon 915. To go further, Canon 916 states, a person who is conscious of grave sin is not to celebrate Mass or to receive the body of the Lord without prior sacramental confession unless a grave reason is present and there is no opportunity of confessing. In this case, the person is to be mindful of the obligation to make an act of perfect contrition, including the intention of confessing as soon as possible. So what if they respect their celibacy and chastity? That doesn't actually matter. Remember, the attraction itself is intrinsically disordered. In 2005, the USCCB actually did something useful and issued a pastoral document that was approved by Pope Benedict XVI, and it made very clear that under no circumstances were men suffering same-sex attraction or even supported the so-called San Francisco culture to be admitted to holy orders. Why? Because same-sex attraction hinders men from relating to men and women in ways that conform to the natural law. This makes men unfit for the priesthood, and, canonically speaking, bishops are fully within their rights to bar men from the sacrament of holy orders. And this is actually nothing new. If you're a Catholic, by now you've probably seen that quote from St. Peter Damian floating around online about same-sex attracted priests. Here are actually a few choice quotes by St. Peter Damian. They are each short. Tell us, you unmanly and effeminate man, what do you seek in another male that you cannot find in yourself? Or, for God's sake, why do you damnable sodomites pursue the heights of ecclesiastical dignity with such fiery ambition? Or, by what right or by what law can one bind or loose the other when he is constrained by the bonds of evil deeds common to them both? Or, who can expect the flock to prosper when its shepherd has sunk so deep into the bowels of the devil? Or, who, by his lust, will consign a son whom he spiritually begotten for God to slavery under the iron law of satanic tyranny? Or, this utterly diseased queen of Sodom renders him who obeys the laws of her tyranny infamous to men and odious to God. Same-sex attraction is intrinsically disordered. The Bible calls sodomy a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance, along with other sins like depriving hired laborers of their wages. The church has always treated this sin in this way. The problem is that men infiltrated the church who rejected this teaching. They were heretics, hence homo-heresy. Men like James Martin and Thomas Rosica are part of the homo-heresy that rejects the church's teaching on same-sex attraction and may themselves be same-sex attracted. In 2012, Father Darius Oko defined homo-heresy as the strong San Francisco lifestyle underground in the church that was strongly and avowedly opposed to the church's infallible teachings on same-sex attraction rooted in scripture and tradition. If you see planned synods that invite large numbers of same-sex attracted people to discuss family and human sexuality, there's a strong chance it was organized by and for heretics. A couple of explicit examples of this are James Martin and Thomas Rosica, both of whom are shockingly close to Pope Francis and who openly advocate for changing the church's teaching on same-sex attraction and sodomy. The effect of heresy is to sow confusion among believers and those who may become believers. It was an attack on the faith itself. In St. Paul's letter to Titus, Paul says that heretics should be silenced because they ruin households and undermine the faith of some in the faithful. In fighting heretics, the church loses time, money, and resources. All of these reasons are why heresy must be stopped as soon as it is detected. But homo-heresy isn't the problem by itself. This is part of a larger web of corruption that all point to what the church has for more than 100 years called the synthesis of all heresies, modernism. In short, modernism is encapsulated by many erroneous beliefs, central of which is that truth does not truly exist, for the church must change its teachings to reflect the times. Truth is chronologically relative. If you've heard anyone quip that we must do something silly like permit men to pretend that they're women because it's the current year, that thinking being mocked is modernism. I'll go further into modernism when I explore the other great infiltrator of the Catholic Church in the sequel to my video on communist infiltrators. In this case, the Freemasons. That video is coming soon. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Remember to like this video and subscribe. I can be found on social media with links in the description. Viva Cristo Rey.